You know, they say that a mother knows her child better than anyone else in the world. We know their cry before they can speak. We know when they are hiding a fever or a broken heart just by the way they walk through the front door. But I've learned something much harder, something much darker over these last few months. I've learned that while a mother knows her child, a wife might not know her husband at all. You can sleep next to a man for 17 years, share a bank account, a home, and a life, and still be sleeping next to a stranger. I want to tell you my story, not because I want pity, I am far past the point of needing pity, but because I need you to understand how thin the veil is between a happy life and a complete nightmare. My name's Elena, and the nightmare didn't start with a scream or a crash. It started with silence. Specifically, the silence of my husband, Mark, in a sterile white room where our only son was fighting for his life. To understand the betrayal, you have to understand what we had before it all fell apart, or at least what I thought we had. Mark and I had been married for 17 years. To the outside world, to our neighbors in our quiet suburban cul-de-sac, we were the gold standard. Mark was an accountant, meticulous, calm, the kind of man who color-coded his closet and never missed an oil change. He was steady. That's the word I always used to describe him to my friends. Steady. He wasn't a man of grand romantic gestures. There were no surprise trips to Paris or poetry written in the sand. But he was there. Every dinner at 6 p.m., every soccer game on Saturdays. And then there was our son, Leo. Leo was 16. He was the sun our entire world revolved around. He had my dark curls and Mark's serious, thoughtful eyes, or so I always told people. He was a good kid, the kind who held doors open for strangers and spent his weekends practicing guitar in his room rather than getting into trouble. Our life was boring, and I loved boring. I cherished it. I thought boring meant safe. It happened on a Tuesday in November. I remember the date because the rain was hammering against the kitchen window so hard I couldn't hear the radio. Leo had come home early from school, complaining of a headache and nausea. I thought it was the flu. It was going around the high school, so I tucked him into bed with some ginger ale and a cool washcloth. But when I went to check on him an hour later, I couldn't wake him. His skin was gray, not pale, but a terrifying, translucent gray. I remember screaming his name, shaking his shoulders, feeling the terrifying limpness of his body. The ambulance ride is a blur in my memory, just a montage of sirens and the paramedic's serious face. By the time Mark arrived at the hospital, rushing in from work with his tie crooked and his raincoat dripping wet, the doctors had already stabilized Leo. But the news wasn't good. It was his kidneys. Genetic, they suspected, or perhaps an autoimmune response that had gone unnoticed until it was too late. Both kidneys were failing rapidly. He needed dialysis immediately, but the doctor, Dr. Aris, a kind man with tired eyes, was clear about the long-term reality. Dialysis is a bridge, not a cure, Dr. Aris told us, sitting across from us in a small, windowless consultation room that smelled of stale coffee and bleach. Leo is young, he's strong, but his best chance at a normal life, his only real chance, is a transplant. I felt Mark's hand tighten around mine. I squeezed back, trying to borrow his strength. "We'll do whatever it takes," I said immediately. The words didn't even pass through a filter, they just erupted from my soul. "Test me, test his father. One of us has to be a match." Dr. Aris nodded. "Family members are often the best bet. We'll start the screening process for both of you immediately. It involves blood typing, tissue typing, and a cross-match. It's a rigorous process, but given that you are his parents, the odds are favorable that one of you will be a suitable donor." I turned to Mark. I expected to see that same determination in his eyes.
I expected him to already be rolling up his sleeve, asking where to sign, asking how fast we could do this. Mark was a problem solver. That was his whole identity. When the roof leaked, he fixed it. When the car broke down, he fixed it. This was our son breaking down. Surely he would fix it. But when I looked at him, I didn't see determination. I saw fear. No, not just fear. It was something evasive. He was looking at the doctor's tie, at the floor, at the wall chart, anywhere but me or Leo. "Of course," Mark said, but his voice was thin. It lacked that deep, resonant timbre I was used to. "But is it safe, the surgery?" "For the recipient, there are always risks. For the donor, it is major surgery, but complications are rare. Most donors live perfectly normal, healthy lives with one kidney." "Right," Mark said. He pulled his hand away from mine to adjust his glasses. "Right, okay." I didn't think much of his hesitation then. I chalked it up to shock. We were all in shock. The next morning, I was the first one at the lab. I gave vial after vial of blood. I sat through the questionnaire. I was desperate. I prayed to a God I hadn't spoken to in years, begging him to let me be a match. "Take mine," I whispered to the empty air in the elevator. "Take both of mine if you have to." But 3 days later, the call came. "I'm sorry, Elena," Dr. Aris said over the phone. "Your blood type is incompatible with Leo's. You have type A, Leo is type O. You can't donate directly to him." I felt like the floor had opened beneath me. I sank onto the kitchen stool, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. "But what about Mark? Has his result come back?" There was a pause on the line, a long, uncomfortable silence. "Mr. Harrison hasn't come in for the testing yet," the doctor said. I blinked, confusion clouding my panic. "What? That can't be right. He said he was going on Tuesday right after work." "No, we have no record of him. We need him to come in as soon as possible, Elena. Leo's levels are stabilizing on dialysis, but time is of the essence here." I hung up the phone, a cold knot forming in my stomach. It wasn't anger yet, it was confusion. Mark was reliable. Mark didn't forget things. If he said he went to the lab, he went to the lab. Maybe there was a clerical error. Maybe they lost his file. I waited for him to come home that evening. I made his favorite dinner, roast chicken with rosemary potatoes, trying to keep things normal, trying to keep the terror at bay. When he walked in, he looked tired. He kissed my cheek, hung up his coat, and washed his hands. We sat down to eat. The sound of silverware scraping against the china felt deafening. "The doctor called today," I said softly, watching him. Mark didn't look up from his potatoes. "Oh? How is Leo doing?" "Leo is holding on, but the doctor told me I'm not a match. My blood type is wrong." Mark stopped chewing. He took a slow sip of water. "I'm sorry, Elle. I know how much you wanted to be the one." "He also said you never went for the test." There was a pause in the line, a long, uncomfortable silence. "I couldn't," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. "You couldn't?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Mark, he's dying. He's our son. He's 16 years old. What are you talking about?" Mark pushed his chair back and stood up. He began to pace the kitchen, running his hands through his thinning hair. "I have a phobia. You know I hate hospitals. You know I get faint at the sight of needles. I can't do a surgery. I can't be cut open. The thought of it, it paralyzes me. I can't do it." I sat there frozen. I looked at this man who had once killed a massive spider in the shower while I screamed, this man who had held me while I pushed Leo into the world, this man who was supposed to be our protector. "A phobia?" I whispered. "You're letting our son stay on dialysis? Letting his body fail because you're scared of a needle?" "It's not just a needle," he snapped, his voice cracking. "It's major surgery. People die under anesthesia, Elena. What if I die? Then Leo has no father and you have no husband. Have you thought about that?" "I have thought about the fact that Leo might not live to see graduation," I screamed, slamming my hand on the table. Mark flinched. He looked cornered. And for a split second, just a flicker, I saw something else in his face. It wasn't just fear. It was guilt. Deep, dark, defensive guilt. "I'm not doing it," he said, his voice dropping to a final, icy tone. "We will find a donor on the registry. We will wait, but I am not getting tested. Do not ask me again." He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with the cold roast chicken and the terrifying realization that the man I loved was a coward. But deep down, in the pit of my stomach, I knew it didn't add up.
The days following that argument were suffocating. The house, usually filled with the low hum of the television or the clatter of dishes, was dead silent. Mark and I moved around each other like ghosts. He slept in the master bedroom. I stayed in the guest room. We didn't speak at breakfast. We didn't speak when he came home from work. He asked about Leo via text message, cowardly little check-ins like, "How are his numbers today?" I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to shake him until his teeth rattled. But I didn't, because anger is loud, but suspicion is quiet. And I was becoming very, very quiet. I needed proof. The day after our fight, I went into the attic. I told myself I was looking for winter blankets, but I was really digging for an old photo album from 5 years ago. I found it under a stack of Leo's old school projects. I flipped through the pages until I found it, a photo of Mark at his company picnic. He was sitting in a folding chair, a bandage on his arm, smiling at the camera with a cookie in his hand. Behind him was the Red Cross blood donation bus. I stared at that photo for a long time. "I have a phobia," he had said. "I faint at needles." Liar. He wasn't afraid of the needle. He wasn't afraid of the surgery. He was afraid of what his blood would say. The realization made my stomach turn. If he was refusing the test because he suspected he wasn't a match, that was one thing. But to refuse to even try, to refuse to even let the doctors check, that suggested he knew something definitive. It suggested he knew he wasn't Leo's father. The thought was so absurd, so impossible, that I almost laughed out loud in the dusty attic. Not Leo's father? That was impossible. Mark was the only man I had been with since college. I had never strayed, not once, not a drunken night, not a moment of weakness, nothing. Mark was the father. There was no other biological possibility. Unless I wasn't a crazy one. Unless there was something I was missing. I needed to be sure. I couldn't confront him with a hunch. Mark was an accountant. He dealt in facts, in hard numbers. If I came at him with feelings, he would gaslight me until I doubted my own name. I needed data. I ordered a discrete paternity test kit online that afternoon. I paid extra for the rush processing, 3 to 5 business days. The website promised anonymity. It promised truth. When the kit arrived 2 days later in a plain brown envelope, my hands were shaking so bad I could barely open it. The instructions were simple: buccal swabs, cheek cells. Easy for Leo. I could just tell him it was part of the transplant workup. But Mark? Mark was watching me like a hawk. If I approached him with a Q-tip, he'd know. I had to be smarter. That Tuesday, Mark came home late. He looked exhausted, the gray circles under his eyes matching the gray of his suit. He went straight to the bathroom to shower. I stood in the hallway listening to the water turn on. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. I slipped into the bathroom while the shower was running. The room was filling with steam. Through the frosted glass door, I could see the blur of his shape. I moved silently to the sink. There, in the ceramic holder, was his toothbrush.
He had just used it. The bristles were still wet. I pulled the sterile swab from my pocket. My hands felt cold. I felt like a criminal in my own home, stealing genetic material from the man I had promised to love and cherish. I rubbed the swab thoroughly against the bristles of his toothbrush, praying it would pick up enough DNA. I shoved the swab back into the plastic tube, sealed it, and slipped it into my pocket just as the water turned off. "Elena," Mark called out from behind the glass, "is that you?" I just needed some aspirin," I lied, my voice sounding too high, too brittle. "For a headache." "Oh," he said. The water stopped dripping. "Okay." I fled the room. The next 5 days were the longest of my life. I spent my days at the hospital with Leo, watching machines clean his blood, watching his skin grow paler. He was so tired. "Dad hasn't come by much," Leo said on the 3rd day, looking at the door. "He's working, honey," I lied. "He's working extra hours to pay for everything." "I guess so," Leo whispered, closing his eyes. "Tell him I miss him." That broke me. I went to the hospital cafeteria and cried into a styrofoam cup of tea. He misses him, I thought, and his father won't even bleed for him? The email came on a Friday evening. I was in the kitchen chopping carrots for a stew neither of us would eat. My phone buzzed on the counter. Subject: "Your test results are ready." I put the knife down. The silence in the kitchen suddenly felt heavy, like the air before a tornado touches down. Mark was in the living room watching the news. I could hear the murmur of the anchor's voice. I unlocked my phone. I clicked the link. I entered my password. The report was a PDF. I had to zoom in to read the small text. I scrolled past the technical jargon, past the loci markers, down to the bottom of the page where the conclusion was printed in bold black letters. Probability of paternity, 0%. Conclusion: the alleged father is excluded from the biological father of the child. I stopped breathing. The world stopped spinning. I read it again and again. 0.0%? It wasn't possible. I grabbed the counter to steady myself. My mind raced backward, scanning every moment of our marriage, every month leading up to Leo's birth. I knew I had never cheated. I knew it in my bones. I was a boring, faithful wife. So how? How could Mark not be the father? And then a memory hit me, a memory from 17 years ago. We had struggled to conceive. For 2 years we had tried, negative test after negative test. Finally, we went to a fertility clinic. We did IUI, intrauterine insemination. It was a simple procedure. They used Mark's sample. The doctor had said Mark's count was a little low but viable. We did the procedure, and 2 weeks later, I was pregnant with Leo. I looked at the phone again. Excluded. If Mark wasn't a...
There is a specific kind of cold that settles in your bones when the person you love takes off their mask. It's not a shivering cold. It's a paralyzing one. When Mark said, "I was wondering how long it would take you to figure that out," he didn't sound like a villain in a movie. He sounded like he was discussing a tax return or a grocery list. He sounded bored. I stood there in the living room, the phone still glowing in my hand, feeling the blood drain from my face. My legs felt heavy, like they were filled with lead. You knew?" I whispered. The air felt too thin to breathe. "How could you know? Did you cheat on me? Did you switch the test?" Mark sighed. He actually sighed, a long, weary exhalation through his nose, like I was the one being unreasonable. He stood up slowly, the leather of his recliner creaking under his weight, and walked over to the sidebar where he kept his scotch. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid splashing against the crystal glass. The sound was sharp, piercing the silence of the house. He took a sip, swirling the liquid, then turned to look at me with that same maddening calmness. "I didn't cheat, Elena. You know I didn't, and you didn't either." He took another slow sip. "I knew because I made sure of it."
What does that mean? My voice was shaking now, a tremor I couldn't control running through my hands. Made sure of it how? Do you remember the fertility clinic? He asked, leaning back against the sidebar. Do you remember how desperate you were back then? You were crying every month when your cycle started. You'd lock yourself in the bathroom and sob into a towel so I wouldn't hear, but I heard. It was pathetic, honestly. You were so obsessed with becoming a mother that you were making yourself sick. I flinched as if he had slapped me. I wanted a family. We wanted a family. You wanted a family, Mark corrected sharply. I wanted a wife who wasn't depressed all the time. But there was a problem, Elena. The doctor told me privately after the first round of tests. I'm sterile, completely. Azoospermia, something from when I was a kid, mumps maybe. It doesn't matter. The point is, I shoot blanks. I stared at him, my mouth falling open. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder. Tick, tick, tick. You never told me? The doctor said your count was low but viable. We saw the charts. I told the doctor to tell you that. I paid him a hell of a lot of money to tell you that. It was a private clinic, Elena. Money talks. And then when we went in for the IUI procedure, I made a switch. The room started to spin. I had to grab the back of the beige sofa to keep from falling. You switched the sample? I authorized a donor, he said, looking at his nail finals. Top of the line, high IQ, clean medical history, similar physical build to me. I signed the papers. I forged your signature on the consent form so they wouldn't ask questions. They thought we were a united front, choosing a donor together. But I knew if I told you the truth, that I was broken, that I couldn't give you a child, you would have looked at me differently. He looked up, and for a second his eyes were cold and dark. Maybe you would have left me. Maybe you would have looked for a man who was whole. I wasn't going to let that happen. He took another sip. So I fixed it. I gave you the baby you wanted, and I let you believe it was mine. It was the perfect solution. You got to be a mommy, I got to keep my wife, and nobody had to know. I looked at him, and for the first time I saw him clearly. He wasn't steady. He wasn't reliable. He was a control freak. He was a man so terrified of losing his possession, me, that he committed fraud. He had violated my body. He had impregnated me with a stranger's child without my consent. You violated me, I whispered. Tears were finally spilling over my lashes, hot and stinging. You forced a medical procedure on me without my consent. That is assault, Mark. That is evil. Mark set his glass down hard. The clink against the coaster sounded like a gavel. It was love, Elena. I did it to keep us together. And it worked, didn't it? We've had 17 good years. Leo has had a good life. I paid for his braces. I paid for his guitar lessons. I have been a father in every way that counts, except for the biology. Except for the part where he is dying, I screamed, finally losing control. Except for the part where he needs a kidney, and you are the only person who knows where half of his genetics come from. Who is the donor, Mark? Who is he? Mark turned away, adjusting his cufflinks with infuriating precision. It was an anonymous donor, Elena. That's how it works. Number 492 or something. I don't know his name, and neither does the clinic. That record is sealed. Even if you wanted to find him, you couldn't. You're lying, I said. You kept everything. You kept the receipt for our first toaster. You kept every tax return since 1998. You have a file. Mark laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Even if I did, do you think I'd give it to you? Think about it, Elle. If this gets out, if you tell me people that I'm sterile, that I committed fraud, that our son isn't mine, it ruins me, my reputation at the firm, my standing in the church. I won't let you blow up my life just on a wild goose chase for a stranger's kidney. He walked towards me, his face close to mine. I could smell the scotch on his breath mixed with the mint of his toothpaste. "Here is what's going to happen," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You are going to go back to the hospital. You are going to tell Dr. Aris that I have a heart condition, something minor but enough to disqualify me from surgery. We will put Leo on the national waiting list. We will pray, and we will stay married. Because if you try to expose me, I will make sure you walk away from this marriage with nothing. No house, no money for Leo's medical bills, nothing." He patted my shoulder, a patronizing, heavy pat, and walked past me up the stairs. I stood in the living room, listening to his footsteps fade. I felt sick, physically, violently sick. I had slept with a monster for 17 years. He didn't care that Leo was dying. He only cared that his secret was safe. But he had made one mistake. He had underestimated me. He thought I was just the emotional, soft-hearted mother. He forgot that I was the one who managed this house. I was the one who knew where the spare keys were. I was the one who knew the combination to the wall safe behind the painting in his study. And I wasn't going to let my son die to protect Mark's ego. I waited. I waited until 2 a.m. I waited until I heard the heavy, rhythmic snoring coming from the master bedroom. It was a sound that used to comfort me, a sign that my husband was home and safe. Now it sounded like the growl of a beast guarding its cave. I slipped down the hallway in my socks. The house was dark, the shadows stretching long and thin across the floorboards. My heart was thumping so loud I was sure it would wake him, but I forced myself to breathe. For Leo, I told myself. Do it for Leo. I slipped into his study and closed the door. I didn't turn on the light. The street lamp outside provided a pale, ghostly glow. I moved the painting of the sailboat aside. There was the safe. Right 20, left 10, right 5. I turned the dial. Click, click, click. The handle turned, the door swung open. Inside were stacks of cash, our passports and legal deeds, and there, at the very back, was a thick manila envelope labeled Medical, Private. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it. I sat on the floor and tore it open. It was all there, the fertility clinic receipts, the invoices, the non-disclosure agreement he had signed, and a profile. Donor profile 8829. Eye color brown, hair dark brown, height 6 foot. Education, PhD candidate biochemistry, medical history clean. There was no name. Mark was right, the clinic kept it anonymous. But Mark, in his obsession with control, had kept something else. Stapled to the back of the profile was a handwritten note on clinic stationery. It looked like a note a nurse or receptionist might have scribbled down during a phone call, something Mark must have swiped or demanded during his negotiations. It said, "Don't worry, Mr. Harrison, the donor is reliable. He's a regular, local med student at the U of M, Paul S." And a date from 17 years ago. I stared at the name. It wasn't much, but it was a thread. A med student at the University of Michigan 17 years ago. First name Paul, last initial S. I didn't leave the room immediately. I couldn't. My legs wouldn't carry me. I sat on the floor of that study with the safe open, the file in my lap, and I felt the physical weight of 17 years of deception crushing my chest. I needed to see it. I needed to see the lie in action to truly understand what I was up against. I dragged myself up and went to the living room cabinet where we kept the old media. My hands were trembling as I found the tape labeled Leo's first birthday. I went to the VCR we kept for nostalgia and shoved it in. The TV flickered to life, static turning into the grainy footage of our old backyard. There was Mark. He was younger, his hair thicker, his smile easy. He was holding Leo, my baby, our baby, up to the camera. "Say hi to Daddy," my voice rang out from behind the camera. "Look at Daddy." On the screen, Mark laughed. He kissed Leo's cheek. He looked so proud. I watched that man on the screen and I tried to reconcile him with the man sleeping upstairs. How could you hold a baby, feed him? Mark looked like he was having a stroke. His mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled out of water, but no sound came out.
The air in the small pre-op room grew heavy, suffocating. He looked from Paul to me, to the IV drip, and back to Paul. The arrogance, the smugness, the steady accountant mask, it all dissolved into pure, unadulterated panic. "You," Mark finally choked out, pointing a shaking finger at Paul. "You're supposed to be anonymous. You signed a contract." Paul didn't flinch. He adjusted the thin hospital blanket over his legs, looking calm, almost regal in his faded gown. I did, and I honored it for 17 years. But then a desperate mother showed up at my office and told me that the man who raised my biological son was willing to let him die rather than bruise his own ego. Contracts tend to lose their weight when a child's life is on the line, Mark. Mark spun on me, his face twisting into a snarl I barely recognized. The veins in his neck were bulging. "Elena, do you have any idea what you've done? If this gets out, if people find out—" "Find out what?" I interrupted, stepping closer to him. My voice was low, but it felt solid, like granite. "Find out that you're sterile? Or find out that you're a coward? Because frankly, Mark, nobody cares about your sperm count. But they will care about the fact that you sat on the couch watching the news while your son was in kidney failure, refusing to help him because you were scared of a DNA test." "I'm his father," Mark shouted. His voice cracked, echoing off the tile walls. The nurse poked her head in, frowning, ready to scold us for the noise, but I waved her off with a sharp look. This needed to finish. "No," Paul said from the bed. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a scalpel. "You were his parent. You were his guardian. You paid the bills and drove the car. But a father is the one getting cut open today. You're just the guy who signed the checks." Mark lunged toward me, grabbing my arm. His grip was painful, desperate. "We are leaving right now. We are stopping this. I will not be humiliated like this. I will not let you ruin my name." I looked down at his hand on my arm. It was a hand I had held during movies, during walks in the park, during labor. Now it felt like a claw. I ripped my arm away from him. It was the last time he would ever touch me. "The only person leaving is you," I said, stepping back to stand beside Paul's bed. "The surgery is happening. Leo is going to live, and when he wakes up, I'm going to tell him the truth. Not about the biology. He doesn't need to know that today. But I'm going to tell him that you wouldn't help him, and that this stranger," I gestured to Paul, "did." Mark stared at me. He saw the end. He saw the divorce, the alimony, the rumors at church, the whispers at his firm. He saw his perfect manicured life crumbling into dust. "If you do this," he hissed, backing toward the door, "don't expect to come home to my house. You'll be on the street." "I don't want your house, Mark," I said, feeling a strange lightness in my chest. "I sold my jewelry yesterday to pay the retainer for a divorce lawyer. He'll be serving you at the office on Monday. Now get out." Mark stood there for one agonizing second. Then, without looking at Paul, without asking about Leo, he turned and walked out the door. He didn't look back. That was the last time I saw him as my husband. The surgery took 4 hours. They were the longest 4 hours of my life, but also the most peaceful. For the first time in months, I wasn't carrying the weight of a secret. I wasn't tiptoeing around a lie. I sat in the waiting room, clutching a styrofoam cup of cold coffee, watching the clock hands move. Tick, tick, tick. I wasn't alone. I felt a strange sense of companionship with the man in the operating room next to my son, a man who owed us nothing but gave us everything. When Dr. Aris came out, beaming,
I collapsed into my mother's arms. "It went perfectly," he said, pulling off his surgical cap. "The kidney is pinking up immediately. It's making urine. Leo is going to be fine." I went to see Paul first in recovery. He was groggy, pale, and clearly in pain. But when he saw me, he offered a weak, tired smile. "Is he okay?" he whispered, his voice raspy from the intubation. "He's perfect," I said, taking his hand. It was warm. "You saved him." "Good," Paul breathed, closing his eyes again. "Worth it." The aftermath wasn't pleasant. The divorce was ugly. Mark fought for every penny, trying to punish me for exposing him. He tried to spin the narrative, telling our friends that I had had an affair, that Leo wasn't his, that I was a liar who tricked him. He tried to paint himself as the victim of a paternity fraud. But the truth has a funny way of rising to the top. I didn't have to scream it from the rooftops. I didn't have to make a scene. I just showed my mother the text messages Mark had sent, refusing the test. I showed the pastor the timeline of the surgery, and slowly, the community. They judged. Oh, they judged. In our small town, abandoning a sick child is a sin that washes away a lifetime of steady behavior. The whispers started. Then the cold shoulders at the grocery store. Then the clients leaving his firm. Mark moved 2 towns over within 6 months. He sends a check for child support now because the court makes him, but he rarely calls. He can't face the son he discarded. As for Leo, I waited until he was strong enough. 3 months after the surgery, when his color was back and he was playing his guitar again, I sat him down on the porch. I told him the truth. I told him about the clinic. I told him about Mark's lie, and I told him about Paul. It was a lot for a 16-year-old to process. There was anger, so much anger at Mark. There were tears. He grieved the father he thought he had. He smashed a few plates in the backyard, and I let him that day. He had earned that rage. But then there was the curiosity. So the guy who gave me the kidney, he's my biological dad, right? Yes, he is. Is he nice? I smiled. He plays the cello, and he likes science, and he drove 4 hours to save you when he didn't have to. Leo nodded slowly. Paul didn't try to step in and be dad right away. He respected the boundaries. He went back to Chicago, but they started emailing, then texting, then video chatting about guitars and architecture. Last summer, Leo and I drove to Chicago. We had dinner with Paul and his wife, a lovely woman who knows the whole story and welcomed us with open arms. I sat there, drinking iced tea, watching my son and his biological father sitting across from each other. They were laughing at the same bad joke, their identical eyes crinkling at the corners. They were talking about structural engineering and sound waves. I realized then that family isn't just blood, and it isn't just history. Family is the people who show up when the sky is falling. Mark built a family on a lie to protect his pride. I rebuilt a family on the truth to save my son. Closing thoughts. I sit here now in a smaller house with a smaller bank account, but a much bigger heart. The silence in my house isn't heavy anymore. It's peaceful. You know, darlings, we spend so much of our lives afraid of the truth. We think the truth will hurt us. We think secrets keep us safe like a warm blanket. Mark thought that if he just controlled everything tightly enough, he could curate the perfect life. He thought he could edit reality like a spreadsheet. But the truth is like water. You can try to hold it back. You can build dams and walls, but eventually it will find a crack. And when it breaks through, it can wash you clean or it can drown you. Mark drowned, but Leo and I, we learned to swim. So I have to ask you, Is there a secret in your house right now that is keeping the peace but rotting the foundation? Is there something you are terrified to say out loud? And if the person you loved most in the world needed you to bleed for them, would you do it or would you run? Think about it. Let me know in the comments below. And remember, sometimes the family you're born with isn't the family you're meant to keep. Sometimes family is the stranger who answers the call. Until next time, take care of yourselves and hold your loved ones close.
Dr. Sterling's office was quiet. It smelled of leather and antiseptic sanitizer, a smell that was becoming all too familiar to me. He sat behind a large mahogany desk, his hands folded in front of him. He didn't look like Mark. Mark was soft, polished, safe. This man had rougher edges, lines of stress around his eyes that came from years of making hard decisions. "You said you have a son," he said, his voice low, "and you said it involves a donation I made 17 years ago." I sat on the edge of the chair, clutching my purse. I felt like I was standing on a cliff edge. One wrong word and I would fall. "I know this is irregular," I began, my voice trembling. "I know I'm not supposed to know who you are. I know the clinic promised you anonymity, but rules don't matter to me right now. My son matters." I reached into my bag and pulled out the manila envelope. I slid the stolen clinic document across the desk, the one with his name scribbled on it. He looked at it. His expression didn't change, but I saw his throat bob as he swallowed. "I was a medical student," he said softly, staring at the paper. "I was drowning in debt. It was a way to pay tuition, and I liked the idea of helping a couple who couldn't conceive. I never thought," he looked up at me, "I never thought I'd see the other side of that equation." "His name is Leo," I said. "He's 16. He plays the guitar. He wants to be an architect, and right now his kidneys are functioning at 8%. Paul leaned back. As a nephrologist, he didn't need me to explain what 8% meant. He knew the fatigue, the toxins building up in the blood, the ticking clock. "Why are you here, Elena?" he asked. "Why not his father?" His father, I spat the word out like poison, refused to get tested. He lied to me for 17 years. He pretended Leo was his biological son, but when Leo got sick, he refused to save him. He was more afraid of his secret coming out than he was of Leo dying. Paul's eyes widened slightly. The professional mask cracked. He refused? "I refused to let my son suffer to protect his own ego," I said. "So I broke into his safe. I found you." I pulled out my phone. I swiped to the picture of Leo, the one from his last birthday before the sickness took the color from his cheeks. He was smiling, holding his guitar, his dark hair falling over his forehead. I turned the phone around and held it up. "Look at him," I whispered. Paul looked. The silence in the room stretched for 10 seconds, 20 seconds. I watched Paul's eyes scan the image. I saw him see it, the jawline, the shape of the brow. It was like looking in a mirror through a time machine. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. "He looks like my brother," Paul whispered, "when we were that age." "He needs a kidney, Dr. Sterling," I said, tears finally spilling over. "I'm not asking for money. I'm not asking for child support. I'm not asking you to be his dad. He has a dad, even if he's a terrible one. I'm just asking you to save a life you helped create." Paul stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the Chicago skyline. I waited, my heart hammering against my ribs. Finally, he turned back. "I'm O positive, universal donor for kidneys." I covered my mouth to stifle a sob. "I can't promise I'm a match," he said, his voice all business now, shielding himself with medical protocol. "We need to do HLA typing, cross-matching. It's a process, and ethically this is a minefield. If the transplant board finds out I'm the biological father from an anonymous donation, they might block it. It's too messy." "We won't tell them," I said quickly. "We'll say you're a distant cousin, a family friend, anything."
Paul looked at me, really looked at me. You'd lie to the board? I'd lie to the Pope if it meant saving my son. A small, sad smile touched his lips. Okay, let's go to the lab. I'll pull some strings. We can get the initial cross-match done stat. The next 48 hours were a blur of sterile needles and waiting rooms. Paul was incredible. He used his connections to expedite the labs. He treated me with a kindness that made my chest ache because it highlighted just how cruel Mark had been. When the results came back, we were sitting in the cafeteria. Paul held the printout. "It's a match," he said. "A near-perfect match. It's better than a sibling match." I put my head in my hands and wept. I wept for the relief, but also for the anger. All this time, the solution was out there. "I'll do it," Paul said. "I'll clear my schedule. We can do the surgery in 2 weeks." "Thank you," I choked out. "Thank you." Paul reached across the table to touch my hand gently. "Elena, you need to go back to him. You need to go back to your husband and get Leo ready. But how are you going to explain this?" I wiped my face. The tears stopped. The sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "I'm going to tell Mark that I found a donor. I won't tell him who. I won't tell him it's you. Not yet." "Why not?" "Because," I said, standing up, "Mark cares about his reputation more than anything. He thinks he won. He thinks he silenced me. I want him to feel safe. And then, when the surgery is done and Leo is safe, I want to destroy him." The drive back home felt different. The highway was the same, but I was different. I arrived home late Sunday night. The house was dark. Mark's car was in the driveway. I unlocked the front door. Mark was in the kitchen, eating a sandwich over the sink. He looked up when I walked in, his face hardening. "You're back?" he said flatly. "I assume you've come to your senses." I put my keys on the counter. I didn't look at him. I opened the fridge and took out a bottle of water. "I went to a specialist in Chicago. I found a donor registry that focuses on difficult cases. They found a match for Leo." Mark froze mid-chew. Suspicion clouded his eyes. "That fast? That's impossible." "It's a miracle," I said, turning to face him. "Just a miracle, Mark. An anonymous donor, a good Samaritan, someone willing to give a part of themselves for a stranger. Imagine that." Mark stared at me, searching for a lie. But I wasn't lying. It was a good Samaritan. Does it cost anything?" he asked. Of course, that was his first question. "Insurance covers the surgery. The donor isn't asking for a penny." Mark relaxed. His shoulders dropped. He actually smiled, a smug, victorious smile. He thought he had gotten away with it. He thought he didn't have to donate, didn't have to expose his secret, and Leo would still live. He got to keep his perfect life. "Well," he said, wiping his hands, "that's wonderful news, Elena. See? I told you we just had to have faith. I told you it would work out." He walked over to hug me. I let him. I stood there, stiff as a board, while the man who almost let our son die wrapped his arms around me. "We're going to be okay," he whispered. "Yes," I said into his shoulder, my eyes open and staring at the knife block on the counter. "We are." The waiting was the hardest part. Those 2 weeks before the surgery felt like walking through a minefield. Mark was terrified that I would slip up, that I would crack, but he underestimated me. I was a vault. 3 days before the surgery, Mark decided we needed to keep up appearances. "My parents are coming for dinner," he announced one morning, adjusting his tie in the mirror, "and the pastor. We need to celebrate the good news." "Celebrate?" I asked, staring at the back of his head. "Or gloat?" "Don't start, Elena," he warned. "We are a united front. The donor is anonymous. We are grateful. That is the script." The dinner was a masterclass in nausea. I sat at the foot of the table, watching Mark pour wine for his father. The roast beef was dry, but everyone was too polite to say anything. "It really is a miracle," Mark's mother said, dabbing her eyes with a napkin. "We were praying so hard for Leo, and to think a stranger just stepped up. Mark, you must be so relieved." Mark smiled. that practiced, charming smile that used to make my knees weak. Relieved isn't the word, Mom. I'm humbled. You know, as a father, you feel so helpless when you can't fix things yourself. I would have given my own kidney in a heartbeat if I could, but with my heart murmur. He trailed off, looking down at his plate with feigned sadness. We know you would have, son, Mark's father said, clapping him on the back. You've always been a provider. You've done everything for that boy. I felt bile rise in my throat. I looked at Mark. He met my gaze, and for a second his eyes narrowed, daring me to speak. Go ahead, his eyes said. Ruin it. Ruin the family dinner. Be the crazy woman. I took a sip of wine. I swallowed the rage. Mark has certainly managed everything, I said, my voice steady. He's handled the details perfectly. Haven't you, darling? Mark didn't blink. I do what I have to do for my family. To the donor, the pastor toasted, raising his glass. To whoever he is. To the donor, Mark repeated, raising his glass high. I raised mine too. To the donor, I thought, who is currently sitting in a hotel room 5 miles away, reading a book, preparing to do the one thing you were too cowardly to do. That dinner sealed his fate for me. If I had any lingering doubts about divorcing him, any small